Hello and welcome to the Daily Aus. I'm Zara.
I'm Nandini. This week, the government's going to introduce legislation that will make it illegal for anyone under the age of 16 to access social media. It comes after the Prime Minister shared further details about the proposal last week, which the opposition has said it's going to support.
Social media is doing harm to our kids, and I'm calling time on it.
Today, we are going to take you through how this law will impact young people, how it will be enforced, and how Aussies have responded to it. But first, Nandini, we've been hearing about minimum age restrictions for social media for what feels like ages. I think a good starting point would probably be for you to just give us a bit of background as to what's happened over the last 6 months. Like, how did we even get here?
So a few months ago, it became clear that both the Labor government and the coalition opposition supported a social media ban for young people.
Which is pretty rare. Like, I think we need to say up front, it's fairly rare to see this sort of bipartisanship.
Absolutely. And then in June, opposition leader Peter Dutton made a promise that if the coalition were to win the federal election, it would ban social media for under 16s. Then in September, the PM said he would introduce legislation before the next federal election, which is meant to be before May next year.
I remember when the government first announced that they were going to be introducing the social media ban, they kind of had this one tile that said, like, we are going to ban it before the end of this year. But there was very little detail that came with that. And then last week, we finally got that detail. So talk me through what we know about what Anthony Albanese wants this social media ban to look like.
So what we've said so far is that we know the government is seeking to ban Australians under the age of 16 from accessing social media.
And that age was a new fact that we learnt last week, because internationally it's been different ages, but here they've settled on 16.
Yeah, and there was also discussions about 12 or 14, but 16 is what they've now said. And when Albanese announced the government's plans late last week, he said the legislation would be a blanket ban for anyone under the age of 16, so no exceptions. It would apply to anyone under 16, even if they had consent from a parent or guardian to be on social media.
Fascinating.
The PM also said that the responsibility is going to fall onto social media companies to ensure that Australian users are 16 years or older.
So there, the practicality point is that it's not on the individual, it's on the platform itself.
Yeah, so young people and parents won't be held responsible in this case, and it is completely up to social media platforms to demonstrate that they're taking reasonable steps to prevent access.
Okay, I think this is a really interesting point because it's leaving this enforcement mechanism up to the tech platforms, who we know have had an interesting relationship with government as of late. So if, for example, Meta or X decides that they don't want to follow this rule, how does the government actually plan to enforce it?
That's a job that's being left to the eSafety Commissioner, which is Australia's online safety watchdog. While there's no actual penalties for users who breach the law, the government said social media companies are going to be subject to those new penalties.
Okay, so if a young person is found to be operating on X, for example, tweeting at the age of 13, they won't get fined. X will get fined.
We don't know if it's a fine or if it's some sort of restriction, but some sort of penalty, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. In a statement from eSafety, the body said that it will ensure companies which profit off Australians are increasingly transparent and accountable.
Okay, so Nandini, the eSafety Commissioner will play a really big role in this, but I guess the other part that still isn't clear is how will the technology behind this ban actually work? How is a 16-year-old meant to prove that they are of age? And there have been lots of ideas floated around about, having to upload identification, but then that, creates a whole new topic of conversation as to who owns that data, and should we be keeping the data of young people in databases owned by tech platforms? And so I think there's a whole lot of work that needs to go into understanding how the government intends for this law to actually work in practice.
There's been a lot of discussion about it. There's been a lot of stuff coming out of the opposition as well, talking about age verification and uses of AI to try and verify that. But so far, there haven't been any further details from the government. This is what they've said so far. And I think we have to keep our eye out and see if they put out further details as it goes through Parliament.
And we know that those age verification trials are currently underway, but they're underway as trials. And if the government is going to pass this legislation by the year's end, we are going to need to have, a bit more of a solid understanding as to what that looks like. You mentioned there that the opposition has talked a lot about these age verification trials. How have they responded to the announcement last week by the Albanese government?
So the coalition's not only welcomed Albanese's announcement, but they've also pledged to work constructively with the government. Shadow Communications Minister David Coleman said that he wants the bill to be passed through Parliament this year, which is just a few months left, and this would mean it would come into effect before the end of 2025. However, he did say that the coalition want to ensure that the legislation is strong and free of any loopholes.
I want to talk about loopholes in a second, but first I think that it should be said that this bill will pass if it has the support of the coalition and obviously the government who is introducing it. So we can expect to see it come into force fairly quickly after it's introduced, which is, as I said, a very rare turn of events. Now, David Coleman there spoke of loopholes, and I wanted to ask you about the under 16s on social media who are famous. I know that this is a bit of a niche topic, but I was thinking about people like Arisa True, who's an Olympian. She's 14. We made a whole big deal about how talented and young she is. She has hundreds of thousands of followers on social media who are following her journey. What would this law mean for someone like her, someone who has amassed a following but perhaps is operating under a parent-managed account?
I think this is so interesting because child influencers are becoming such a big thing, even when it comes to prodigies, like musical prodigies and athletes. But what we know so far is that it's a blanket ban. If you're under 16, you won't be allowed to be on social media. The government said it's not making any exceptions. So I think that this is a very interesting space to watch and to see how the government will navigate it, but also how these users might respond to the ban if it's implemented.
We're talking about this at a federal level, obviously the federal government led by Anthony Albanese, but we have also on this podcast before spoken about a push at a state level. I spoke at a social media summit held by the New South Wales government and the South Australian governments earlier this year. We know that there's a push there. How do these two things work?
So the South Australian government has been a particularly active state when it comes to this topic. Earlier this year, the state proposed laws to ban children under the age of 14 from accessing social media. And as you mentioned, they hosted a social media summit with the New South Wales government last month. And so these states are working closely with the federal government to implement a minimum age requirement for social media. There was actually a National Cabinet meeting on Friday, and that's where the Prime Minister and the state and territory ministers gathered to discuss the issue of young people on social media. And out of that meeting, the states and territories endorsed the government's decision to introduce this legislation.
I think where I get confused is that we've just said that South Australia has a proposed ban for anyone under the age of 14, but the federal government is looking at 16. If you are a South Australian who is 15, what happens to you?
That's definitely a point that's been brought up, and I think there's a bit of confusion there too. There's been some discussion around what, I guess, the right age to do this would be, but it seems that the government has landed on 16 as the magic number.
Fascinating. All right. So moving on, we have spoken about the fact that this is one of those rare times where both the government and the opposition are on the same page. But that doesn't mean that there aren't any opposing voices to this social media ban. Can you talk me through what some of the criticism, or I guess lowercase o opposition to this proposed legislation has been?
There's been a lot of discussion around this topic, not just in recent weeks, but in the past few months. The government is coming from the angle of wanting to protect young people from the many harms of social media. But what a lot of independent organisations and academics have pointed out is that social media does have a positive side. Around 2 months ago, a bunch of mental health services came together and said that a blanket ban on social media is not the answer. Organisations like Reach Out, Headspace and Black Dog Institute basically said that while there are concerns surrounding the impacts of social media on young people, new safety features and limitations on the platform would be more suitable measures as opposed to a blanket ban.
Okay, so they're suggesting there that it needs to be things like restricting the infinite scroll, all of us have been there, or improving young people's literacy when it comes to navigating social media, not just banning them altogether.
Exactly. And these organisations have also suggested having the option to reset your algorithm, which I think is really interesting. And that could help limit harmful content which might be recurring in your feed. There was also some research conducted by Reach Out, which found that nearly 3/4 of young people use social media to access mental health support.
That's really interesting.
And so I think that's one of the positive sides to social media. It makes resources, but also different communities and groups of people accessible to one another.
Yeah, and I know that there's been a lot of talk about, young people who live in remote or regional areas and that they engage in communities online.
Definitely. And some academics from the Australian National University, or ANU, said last month that the online world is also a place where children and young people can access information, connect with family and friends, and learn about the world around them. These experts have argued that the government's proposed blanket ban could impinge upon the rights to access and participate in the digital world.
Yeah, so there are obviously these connectivity points about, different communities that are able to use and engage with social media. But then there's also the kind of literal steps of how do you actually ban young people who will likely find another way?
Exactly. And these are things that we're waiting on more confirmation from. But something that came out from UNICEF Australia is that if young people are banned from social media and they want to use it, considering we're talking about that digital native generation, they're probably going to figure out a way around the restrictions. And that was from the head of policy and advocacy at UNICEF Australia.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work to be done in really laying out the course here and how this will work in practice. And, it is a huge undertaking and a huge change, Even something as small as the fact that we have people that access our news via social media who are under the age of 16. And I know a lot of separate conversations can be had about whether children should be reading the news or not. But there are so many implications at every point of the journey here. So I'm really interested to see where the government lands on this and how they will enforce it. Definitely one to keep an eye on. But thank you so much, Nandini. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Daily Aus podcast. If you learnt something from this episode, please feel free to send it to a friend or give us 5 stars on whatever platform you are listening on. We so appreciate your support, and we'll be back again tomorrow with another deep dive.